All right, so today we're going to be talking about Christopher Columbus and the Spanish in this episode of Colliding Cultures. So let's get into it, shall we? So Columbus and his East Indies. After 2 months at sea, the Niña Pinta and Santa Maria landed in the present-day Bahamas on October 12th, 1492. Columbus sailed from island to island, looking for pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, and other objects and merchandise whatsoever that he had promised to bring back to his Spanish patrons. In January of 1493, he left several dozen men behind in a makeshift settlement on Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. However, when he returned, the settlement had been destroyed, and so he worked towards the reestablishing of said settlement, of the settlement of Hispaniola. And Columbus made 4 voyages to the Caribbean between 1492 and 1504 that took him to the Caribbean islands, South America, as well as Central America. Columbus's rule of Hispaniola was violent as well as tyrannical. You even have Spanish colonists rebelling against Columbus because of his cruelty. So, for example, there's an instance where a woman was talking badly about Columbus and his family, and he had her stripped naked and publicly paraded around on a horse to mock and shame her. And so in 1500, there was an insurrection on the behalf of the Spanish colonists, right? And so in 1500, Columbus was arrested for his treatment of European colonists, not indigenous peoples, of Hispaniola, and he was returned to Spain. Don't worry, he came back. So he returned for a final voyage before returning to Spain and then dying shortly thereafter in 1506. And so soon after Columbus's voyage, we see the Treaty of Tordesillas, where you have Pope Alexander VI, impressed by the loyalty of both Spain and Portugal to Catholicism, or to Roman Catholicism, right? We see him dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal. Mind you, he has no authority to do this, but he's the Pope, so he can do what he wants, right? And so basically an imaginary line of demarcation was created, running north and south through the Atlantic at approximately 1,100 miles from Cape Verde, which is off the coast of West Africa. So on the left-hand side, here's Cape Verde. And the original line of demarcation that was established in 1493, which was then later extended because the Portuguese were like, hey, we don't have enough of North America. So the second line was established in 1494. And so as a result, you have the Spanish being given access to all of North and South America except for Brazil. And so we see the Portuguese getting access to the land that is now considered to be Brazil, as well as the continent of Africa. So you have the Portuguese, as a result, becoming the first people to really engage in and begin profiting from the transatlantic slave trade. And then we see the Spanish profiting from their invasion of the New World. You have the Spanish, who are very invested in the exhausting of the natural resources of the Caribbean as well as present-day Latin America, right? And so they developed a system called encomienda. And encomienda was an exploitative feudal arrangement where Spain tied indigenous laborers to large estates. And the Spanish crown granted a person not only land, but also a specified number of indigenous peoples. They did not consent to this. Encomenderos, who were the owners of the encomienda, brutalized their laborers, right? But in theory, indigenous laborers were supposedly provided with benefits. Benefits such as being converted to Catholicism, learning Spanish. Also, They were to be protected from warring tribes and also pirates, European pirates specifically. And so indigenous peoples were not individually selected per se to be enslaved, but the crown would grant a specified number of indigenous peoples from a particular community, but they weren't the ones who dictated which individuals in the community would provide their labor. They would have indigenous leaders being charged with mobilizing and mobilizing labor. So indigenous peoples are deciding, as well as organizing tribute or tax, right? Goods in the form of a tax to be paid to the crown. And tributes could look like metals, maize or corn, wheat, pork, as well as other agricultural products. We also see the requerimiento, where upon encountering indigenous peoples, Spanish military captains were required to read to them a long and rhetorical requerimiento, a request, which exhorted them to adopt Catholicism or else. So oftentimes these requests were read in Latin to indigenous peoples with no translators, no interpreters present. Sometimes they were even delivered from the ship. Like, hey, y'all, practice Catholicism or else, right? No one can hear them. Or to even an empty beach, which the requerimiento is a reflection of the prime purpose or the prime role that Catholicism played in the New World, which was a justification for invasion. Additionally, there's the casta system. And so casta or caste speaks to a social system in which class status is determined at birth, right? And so the Spanish, because there weren't that many Spanish women coming to the Spanish colonies, the Spanish men frequently had mixed race children in the Americas with enslaved Africans as well as indigenous peoples. And so as a result, we see status being determined by how Spanish people were, right? So therefore, those with little to no Spanish blood were in the lowest caste. Those with the utmost Spanish blood were seen as being more elite. I will argue you can still see this even making its way into the present day in many Latin American nations. But at the top, you have peninsulares, which was a term used for Spaniards from Spain. You have criollos, which was a term used at the time for Spaniards born in the Americas. You have mestizos and mulatos, which was a term for the descendants of a Spaniard and a Native American. Mulattos, the term for a Spaniard and an enslaved African. And then at the very bottom, you have indios and negros. Right, so indios are descendants of two indigenous parents, negros, two African parents. And so this racialized system is one that organized power and organized labor in the Spanish New World. And so after greatly benefiting from colonies in Mexico, the Caribbean, South America, Spain began to expand into the present-day United States. And so 1513, you have Juan Ponce de Leon arriving in La Florida. And European colonizers had hoped to find great wealth in Florida. However, their imagination and reality were not necessarily in alignment. And so Spanish colonizers often fought frequently with Florida's indigenous peoples, as well as with other Europeans. So in the 1560s, we see Spain expelling French Protestants, the Huguenots, from an area near modern-day Jacksonville, Florida. We also see in 1586, English privateer Sir Francis Drake burning down the wooden settlement of St. Augustine. And Spain's reach in Florida extended from the mouth of the St. Johns River into St. Augustine's, which basically was like 1,000 square miles. And the Spaniard basically attempted to replicate their methods for establishing control that they had used previously in Mexico, the Andes, and the Caribbean. And so the crown granted missionaries the right to live among the indigenous peoples of the Timucua and the Guale in the late 1500s and early 1600s. And they also encouraged settlement through the encomienda system. And by the mid 1700s, there were more than 100 missions established in Spanish Florida. One of the most powerful indigenous populations at this time was the Apalachee. And so the Apalachee claimed territory from modern Florida-Georgia border to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Apalachee farmers grew an abundance of corn as well as other crops. This symbol on the left-hand side is the symbol of the Apalachee people. And the Spanish settlers would drive cattle eastward across the St. Johns River and establish ranches as far west as Apalachee Nation. And in the 1630s, the mission system extended into the Apalachees territory in the Florida Panhandle. So moving ever westward, we have the Spanish and New Mexico. And so in 1598, Juan de Oñate led 400 settlers, soldiers, and missionaries from Mexico into New Mexico. So Oñate decided he was going to get the ball rolling by sacking the Pueblo city of Acoma, which means Sky City. And so there were about 1,500 inhabitants of Acoma. The Spaniards slaughtered nearly half of them, including their women and children. And then Oñate ordered 1 foot to be cut off every surviving male over the age of 15, and he enslaved the remaining women and children. In 1610, you have the colony of Santa Fe being established. And so few Spaniards relocated to the Southwest because they were like, it's hot, it's dry, this environment's hostile, and also because it's far from Mexico City. By 1680, only about 3,000 colonists called Spanish New Mexico home. And it was there that they traded and exploited the local Puebloan people. And the region's Puebloan population plummeted from nearly as many as 60,000 in 1600 to 17,000 just a mere 80 years later. And so this brings us to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. So in 1670s, the Spanish governor of New Mexico ordered several Pueblo holy men to be executed and many others to be publicly whipped. One of the men who was publicly whipped in Santa Fe was by the name of Popey, who was a holy man, and also he was the war captain of Oke Owinge. And him being publicly humiliated did not inspire him to acquiesce. If anything, it hardened his resolve to get the Spanish the hell out of New Mexico. And so Popey, who is referred to by the Spanish as San Juan Pueblo, he organized and led a revolt. And so he sent runners to all the local pueblos carrying knotted cords, which represented the number of days to the uprising, right? So each day was represented by a knot. You undo the knot. When you're out of knots, it's time to revolt, right? It's go time. And so the successful revolt kept the Spanish out of New Mexico. And when the Spanish returned, a different type of power dynamic was established. And the Pueblo Revolt holds great historical significance because it helped ensure the survival of Pueblo cultural traditions, lands, languages, religion, as well as sovereignty. So Spain also used the mission as a strategy for colonization. And missionaries provided Spain with an advance guard in North America, right? Catholicism had always justified Spanish conquest, and colonization had always carried the religious imperatives. By the 17th century, Spanish friars established dozens of missions along the Rio Grande, as well as the treatment of indigenous peoples led to the creation of what was called the Black. And so the Black legend was rooted really in the criticisms that were first voiced by Spanish people. So like De las Casas, who was condemning the maltreatment of indigenous peoples. We see him talking about how the soul of indigenous peoples was being broken and instead we need to use African labor. He later recanted that too, but no one knew it because it wasn't published until 300 years later. And so, but you have the words of De las Casas being used by other Europeans in order to inspire their own colonization, right? It provided an ideological sanction for English, the Dutch, and French involvement in the New World, right? The English, Dutch, and French saw themselves as being better than the Spanish because they're like, oh, well, we would never torture indigenous peoples in the ways that the Spanish have. And because of this, we should have the right to colonize this land because we'll colonize it better. And so the impact of European arrival. So you have 95% of indigenous peoples perishing within the first 130 years of contact with Europeans. And much of this is due to disease, right? So you have 10,000 years of diseases that were taking place in Europe, hitting the New World all at once. Everything from smallpox to typhus to the bubonic plague to influenza to mumps to measles. Pandemics ravaged populations up and down the continents of North and South America. We also see a major shift in domesticated animals, as well as in global diets, right? The diets of both Europeans and indigenous peoples vastly were impacted. So even modern day associations often come as a result of what is termed the Columbian exchange, which is this exchange of foods as well as diseases, as well as domesticated animals, right? So for example, we often associate Ireland with potatoes, but they come out of North America. We associate tomatoes with Italy, also come from North America. Chocolate in Switzerland, North America. Peppers in Thailand, North America. And also oranges in Florida are all manifestations of this global exchange, right? Because you have citrus fruits coming from Europe, for example, into Florida, right? And so we see on the right-hand side this kind of visual map of exchange animals as well as foods. So also the Europeans introduced animals such as pigs, which we remember because they wreaked havoc and caused a lot of disease throughout the American South in places like Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, right? But also we see horses being introduced, which greatly shifted the culture of many indigenous peoples through their utilization of horses. All right, so we'll pause here. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.